Still have 3 bracelets found in the parking lot following one of our services. Unclaimed at this point will be in the box on the door to Tracy's office. If you own them, see me immediately after services and you won't have to walk all the way down the hall. For some of you, I know that's important. Found following our Wednesday evening service this past week, 1 gold hoop earring. I thought for a moment Ed's hand was going up, but it wasn't. If this is yours, please see me or check the box on the door in Tracy's office. We're grateful for your presence tonight. It's always a delight on the Lord's Day to come together in a setting like this and to be able to share from God's Word. I don't know that we could pick a text that is more familiar than the 23rd Psalm. Nearly every one of you can quote this psalm from memory. That's a good thing. There are lots of people who have no real religious affiliation who know this psalm, know it reasonably well. I read about a youngster that was challenged with his fellow students to memorize the psalm, and then each in succession would stand before the congregation and recite from memory these beautiful verses. This particular youngster came to the front and stood before the congregation and said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That's all I need to know." And I think he was probably right in reference to life and what we truly need to know. If the Lord is our shepherd and we know it, it's going to make life a whole lot easier for us. We'll have less anxiety. We'll walk with, I believe, a broader gait. There'll be a smile on our face more often and truly a song in our heart, because we know if the Lord is our shepherd that things are well, that He's watching over us, and we truly have nothing to fear. This is a Psalm of David, and David does what I believe came very naturally to him in this psalm. He looks back on his own life and no doubt reflected on his role as a shepherd. You may recall when Samuel came calling in Bethlehem in search of a successor for Saul, he examined each of the sons of Jesse, and with each one, God said, "No, this is not the one." He finally asked, "Is there another?" To which the response was, "Yes, the youngest who is out caring for the sheep." As it turns out, David was God's man. Back in 1 Samuel 13, I believe around verse 15, God had spoken through the prophet that he would have one after his own heart that would come to the throne to succeed Saul. We don't learn until chapter 16 that that one was none other than King David. And I've always found it somewhat encouraging that a man after God's own heart could fall as hard as he fell in relationship to Bathsheba, 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12, and yet be able to rise above it all to find forgiveness and go on to serve God very faithfully. Men after God's own heart, and women as well, are never perfect. And they can fall, and sometimes fall hard, as David did. But when there's genuine repentance, and if you read Psalm 51, you know that David genuinely repented of his sin and found forgiveness. In fact, the prophet Nathan assures David that his sin has been forgiven, and yet reminded him that the consequences of his actions would remain with him throughout the rest of his life. That the child that had been conceived in that unholy relationship was going to die, and troubles would plague David's family from that point onward, and it's true that that's exactly what unfolded. But he did find forgiveness and went on to do very great things in the service of God. Never write anyone off. Everybody has value, genuine worth in the eyes of the Maker. Jesus truly did die for all of us, and there are no souls beyond the power of the blood of Christ to cleanse and ultimately to provide a home not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. What I propose to do tonight as we look at this psalm is to take the text, which is so very familiar to you, and go back to the days of David and his role as shepherd, and come to understand this text in a way that we probably don't if we don't see the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. So we begin our process of study tonight with the very first verse. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. What do we have? We have, in essence, a very calm statement of fact. The Lord provides. Do you believe that? Do you genuinely believe that God takes care of his children? I believe that the greatest responsibility that God gives us beyond our responsibility to serve him as his children is, as parents, to do the best we possibly can to bring up our children in his nurture and admonition. This is what we are admonished to do in Ephesians chapter 6. And I also believe that parents, if they are what they ought to be, are going to do everything within their power to see that their offspring have everything they need. Not everything they want, but everything they need. We, to the best of our ability, will provide. If that's true of us in relationship to our children, how much more so must that be when we think about our relationship to God, our Father, and we his children? For David to capture that, he uses the metaphor of the shepherd and the sheep. Obviously, the shepherd represents God, and the sheep, God's people. When the Lord is our shepherd, he takes care of us. Psalm 37:25 makes this statement: I've been young, am now old. One thing I have not seen, the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. What is that but an affirmation of the truth of this text? God takes care of his own. But just as surely as good parents don't give their children everything they want, that makes them spoiled. And unless we're talking about cabbage, that's not a good thing. And good parents will not give their children everything they want, because that's not a good thing. But the needs are met. God has promised to meet our needs. You see this in Matthew 6, in the very center of the Sermon on the Mount, verse 8. And then when you get to the close of the text, you find Jesus arguing that God does look after his own. Just as surely as he feeds the birds and clothes the lilies, he will take care of us. But there is a condition: we must seek first the kingdom and its righteousness. And Paul underscores a similar message in chapter 4 of his Philippian epistle, verse 19. So, accept as Christians tonight that God truly is your shepherd, if you are truly his sheep, And He's going to look after you so that you go home tonight, you pillow your head, and you fall off into restful sleep, knowing that you can't fix everything, that you can't solve everything, but you have the Father, the Creator of the universe, on your side. And He's promised to meet your every need. No shepherd doing his job as he should would allow his sheep to starve, place them in circumstances that they could not deal with. But we do everything within His power to meet their needs and provide all that is required for abundant living. That's the promise of God. The next statement is, He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Do you know when the shepherd's day began? According to historians, around 4 in the morning already. Most of you are saying, that's not my kind of job. But they generally took the sheep out into the pasture around 4 in the morning, and they grazed usually until about 10. Sheep are the kind of animals that walk continually as they graze. They never are still. So I'm told. I have no personal experience with sheep. I've had personal experience with cows and horses and chickens and turkeys, even a goose. But I've never been around sheep. But I have read a lot about shepherds and their sheep and the process, especially as it would have unfolded in the days of David. And so they would leave the sheepfold very early in the morning, and the shepherd would lead them to productive pasture. And that could be quite a challenge. Somebody asked me this morning about the geography of Palestine. Do you remember when God promised Israel Canaan, He described it as a land flowing with milk and honey? Modern Palestine today, in many ways, is a very barren piece of property. Even in the first century, it was rocky and hilly, and there were treacherous paths, and the shepherd had to be very careful. And so the psalmist says, just as surely as the shepherd leads his flock out of the fold into the pasture, he will, knowing their needs, by around 10 in the morning, make them lie down in green pastures. This gives the sheep opportunity to digest the food that they've taken in their early morning grazing. The shepherd knows that it's never good for the sheep to drink immediately after eating. So they have opportunity to rest, to digest, and then the shepherd will resume his work with the flock. Now, what does that mean for us, ladies and gentlemen? May I suggest to you, it's simply this: God knows our need for rest like the shepherd knew the needs of the sheep. The psalmist asserts in 46:10 to be still and know that I am God. Every one of us needs some quiet time, some time to rest, to reflect, and to meditate, some time to be refreshed and renewed. That is what the shepherd provided for the sheep. And God provides those same opportunities for us. You go all the way back to the law of Moses, the Ten Commandments, and look at what God told Israel. You shall remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy and do no work therein. Was that because God needed His creation to set aside a day? No, it's because His creation needed such a day. Jesus said the Sabbath was not made for man. Pardon me. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. That we need a certain amount of downtime. Everybody does. Someone who is, as we would say today, a workaholic is going to work himself or herself into an early grave. Not only does our body require this quiet time, this rest, if you please, our families need it. There are things that we must do that are absolutely essential that require time, and we have to set aside that time to lie down, so to speak, in green pastures, to find what God provides to his sheep. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. I would point out to you immediately that sheep have to be led. They can't be driven. We herd cattle, we lead sheep. And they have absolutely no sense of direction. If you take a cat out in the country and release it, it has the ability to find its way back home. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that you do that, just in case you're wondering. But cats and dogs and horses, they'll have a real sense of direction. And everybody's heard of homing pigeons. Sheep are not like that. They have to be led. They also have very poor eyesight. According to those who study these things, they have vision that reaches out 10 to 15 yards ahead, not much more. That's not very good eyesight. An eagle flying in the heavens can look down and spot a trout near the surface of the lake and swoop down and grab that rascal and fly away because of its wonderful eyesight. Sheep are not like that. And the shepherd in Palestine led his sheep into fields that often were very dangerous. They therefore needed to be led. So what does that mean? It means that, frankly, again, borrowing the metaphor, we're all like these sheep in need of someone to lead us. God's provided that leadership, and he doesn't drag us along. We have to choose to follow him. I think of several passages when I think about how important it is to have a shepherd leading us in a spiritual sense. There's a way, the writer of Proverbs wrote, that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. That's stated twice, if memory serves me correctly, in chapter 14 and then again in chapter 16. I believe it's 16:25 and maybe 14 something. But it's there. Have you ever been absolutely certain of something only to discover how wrong you were? I have, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. And if you tell me you haven't, I will reschedule next Sunday's sermon. It'll be on lying, because we've all been there, done that. That's our nature. That's why we look to the Word, to God's Word, to direct our steps. It was Jeremiah who made a similar observation in Jeremiah chapter 10 about our need for direction. We all need a shepherd to lead us. And our shepherd as Christians is none other than Jesus Christ, the shepherd and bishop of our souls. Our success or failure in the Christian endeavor will be determined by how carefully we follow in the footsteps of our shepherd. He's leading, and as his sheep, we need to be following. And he leads us in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And that's not a difficult concept to comprehend. Righteousness involves that which is right. Jesus will never lead us to do what is wrong, but will always direct us toward the right. And depending on how closely attached we are to our shepherd, we will either follow him or run the risk of straying and suffering the consequences. Verse 4, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Now, the picture, I don't know how clear these things are on the board behind me, but the picture is of a valley. over in Palestine that was called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. I believe that the passage is to be understood in a metaphorical sense and not to be taken in the literal sense, but it helps to know the terrain and be familiar with what those people were familiar with, David in particular, as he writes this text. This particular passage leads from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea. It is narrow, dangerous, and one misstep, and it could be life-threatening. So you need someone leading the way who knows the way and can avoid the obstacles and dangers that inevitably we encounter. And that's what the psalmist is saying when he talks about his relationship with the Lord. He is my shepherd. He's leading me, and he's leading me through these difficult valleys, these paths of danger, protecting me from the harm that lurks around every corner. We generally use this passage in relationship to death, the valley of the shadow of death, the last journey we make from this realm to the eternal. None of us have had the experience before, and to make it alone, in my judgment, would be something extremely difficult to contemplate. But you note in Scripture, we don't make that journey alone. The Lord has promised to be with us. Elsewhere in the Psalms, it is asserted precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of one of his saints. No child of God, none of the sheep exit this world for eternity alone. When a saint leaves this realm for the eternal, God takes note. And if you look at the story in relationship to death told by Jesus about the rich man and Lazarus, who ultimately ends up in Abraham's bosom, is taken there by an angel. He doesn't make that journey alone. And what the psalmist is asserting here, again, when we take something that's very real and literal and give it its metaphorical application, is when we face death, we don't face that alone. The Lord who leads us doesn't abandon us at the most trying and difficult hour of our existence, but has promised to be there to show us the way. The passage in Hebrews 2, verse 9, is a passage about the incarnation of Jesus, when the Son of God leaves heaven and comes into this world and takes on human form, becomes a man, one of us. It is said that he lowered himself, lower than the angels, to become like you and me. Why? For the purpose of suffering and dying, that he might taste death for every man. And to understand that metaphor, you need to know that it has its roots in the simple practice of always tasting the food and beverage served to the monarch. And only when it has been tested and demonstrated to be safe does the king or queen eat or imbibe. And using that analogy, Jesus tasted death for all of us to show us that it's okay, safe if you please, not something to be feared. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. That's the hope of every Christian. In Hebrews 13, 5 and 6, the writer quotes a promise Jesus made before his ascension. It's recorded in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. Jesus asserts, I have all authority in heaven and on earth. You are to go and make disciples, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And lo, I am with you always, even until the end of the world or the end of the age, depending on your translation. So the Hebrews writer, remembering that promise, says that we're to follow God, not men. Let him, in essence, be our shepherd, And when we do, we will remember the promise of Jesus, I will never leave you nor forsake you, so that you may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man may do unto me. Which ought to remind you as Bible students of the promise of Matthew 10. Jesus told his disciples he did not come to bring peace but a sword, described the kinds of conditions that would arise, how those who chose to follow him would be alienated from sometimes the closest people in their lives, their parents, their mates, their children. And then he warns them, don't be afraid of what men can do to you. The worst they can do is kill you. Be afraid of what God can do, for he can cast the soul into hell. But if he's truly our shepherd, and we're really his sheep, he has something far better in store for us. And the journey we make to our ultimate destination requires our death. But as Christians, as sheep of the Good Shepherd, we have nothing at all to fear. That I find to be one of the most comforting thoughts when someone close passes. That and something David said when the child that he and Bathsheba had, the son, died. While the boy was sick, if you go over to 2 Samuel and read the narrative, the text tells us that David fasted and prayed. And obviously, he's praying that God might spare his son. But when the child died, David immediately bathed himself, changed his garments, and commanded his servants to prepare a meal. And they were beside themselves. They really thought that the king might take his own life if the son died. They're perplexed by his response to the news that the boy is dead. To which David said, these are his words, I cannot bring him back, but I can go where he is. The same David who wrote this beautiful psalm and said, for those who are truly God's sheep, we can walk through the valley of the shadow of death and fear no evil. Thy rod and thy staff comfort me. I couldn't find a picture that was really appropriate for the rod. The one that you see here with the staff is longer than the typical rod that would be carried by a shepherd. The staff was usually about 8 feet long and had the hook that you see in this one that helped in rescuing sheep that have fallen off a ledge and out of arm's reach. The rod was shorter, and it was used essentially as a club. We might think in terms of a baseball bat, in order to defend the sheep and protect them from robbers and thieves and wild animals. David himself described killing both a lion and a bear. These are typical weapons, but they provide comfort for the sheep when the shepherd uses them appropriately. That's because sheep are helpless animals. You ever been kicked by a horse? I have. Bitten by one? I have. You ever been drugged by a bull? I have. But sheep have never bothered me. Again, I haven't been around them. But from everything I've read, they're pretty docile animals. Darrell probably knows more about sheep than I ever will. And I don't think he's been injured too much by them. He just looks that way because he looks that way. They're helpless. Aren't we really? Without God on our own, we really are helpless. So the shepherd had the rod and the staff, and he used them to protect his sheep. God has methods and means to keep us safe. And again, he hasn't promised us that life will be trouble-free. What he's promised us is that in the midst of the trouble, he'll be right there with us so that we can be calm, cool, and reassured. We simply must learn to trust the shepherd. Paul asserted for God's people, we walk by faith, not by sight. Do we really? When we fret and worry and get worked up, overly worked up and concerned about things that are simply out of our control, we're trying to walk by sight, not by faith. When we walk by faith, we acknowledge that God really is in control. He doesn't expect me to do what I can't do, just what I can. And the rest we leave in His hands. And honestly, folks, I see us so often, in the general sense, walking by sight, not by faith. And letting things that in the great scheme of things that really don't matter way too much, while we ignore the things that matter most. God is there for us. His rod, His staff, they still comfort. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. One of the things I did as a boy growing up on the farm was chop weeds. I never liked to do that. You probably figured out by now, if it's work, I really don't like to do it. And that's the honest truth. I do it, but I don't get real joy out of a lot of the things that I've had to do over the years that have been manual in nature. My dad, before he went to work every day, had chores that we had to do before we could do anything else. And one of them in the spring was to go through the pasture field and chop down the thistles and the ironweed and the milkweed and anything else that wasn't productive. And we would do that on a regular basis. He also expected us to go out and pick up the rock. You know, in West Virginia, rocks just grow. Every spring, they just sprout up. And so every spring, you go out and you pick rock up and put it in the rock pile. And then, before winter, we haul the rock pile to the driveway, and we take the sledgehammer and we bust that stone up, and that's the foundation. That's how we did it till I went to college, and then they started having gravel hauled in. My dad changed a lot of things when I left. And I've reminded him of that a lot too. I saw some of you smiling. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? The shepherd would go out, and the Palestinian fields were filled with thistles and sometimes weeds, plants that were harmful to the sheep. And they would prepare the grazing land. And so the shepherd, knowing this, again, uses it to help us understand what God does for us. He offers protection. He really is looking out for His sheep, just as surely as the shepherd did. And He's assured us that we will never face anything, not a single temptation, but once, when it raises its ugly head, He will provide the way to escape. Our problem is often we don't look for the way that God has provided, or when we see it, we won't take it. But it's there. To the extent the Lord is our shepherd, we take the way to overcome that God provides. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. When the shepherd brought his sheep into the fold every night, he examined each carefully, looking for sores and cuts and any problems they might have encountered during the day. And if he finds any, he pours oil on the wound, which aided in cleansing and helping the healing process. I'm also told that good shepherds would whisper in the ear of every sheep. And by the way, you may recall that Jesus used a similar analogy in John's gospel to talk about the sheep know the shepherd's voice. In fact, on occasion, many shepherds would bring their sheep into the same fold at night, and in the morning when they rose to go out to graze, the shepherd would merely call, and his sheep would come to him. And the shepherd who had other sheep would call, and those sheep belonging to him would answer that voice. I wish we were as attentive to the voice of God today as sheep are to their shepherd. What does this mean for us? in life we can expect bumps and bruises, cuts and scrapes. I want you to know it's just unrealistic to think you can go through life unscathed. You're going to have your share of cuts and bruises. You need to know that God is there to help you overcome them, just like the shepherd does the sheep. So goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. What you have is a picture here of a typical ancient sheepfold made out of stone. And I don't know if you can see or not because it's really small. The door of the sheepfold, this is where the shepherd would sleep at night. No sheep could get out without passing over the shepherd. He was there to assure that they stayed safe within the fold until night had passed and grazing could begin. Sheep in the care of a good shepherd had no fear. If sheep had no fear in care of a good shepherd, surely we have no reason to fear today. We know that our shepherd will watch over and protect us and ultimately lead us through the trials and tribulations of life to our eternal home. We know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle be dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. But this is only true if we're God's sheep. And nearly all of you are, but not all of you. Some of you have yet to hear the shepherd's voice, respond to his call, and become part of his flock. But that can be remedied tonight if you're willing to just do what the Scriptures demand. We'll help you. Won't ask anything of you that hasn't been asked of every man and woman since the church began at Pentecost. And we can promise you that you'll receive the same blessings, know the same joys, and have the same shepherd who will watch over you, protect you, and ultimately lead you into the presence of God. If only you're part of his. Can we help you?